Bowen continued to look at him with disbelief. Someone said, "I have a question." It was the Go Sage raising his hand for attention. Yes. No one else said anything, so Maomao called on him as a teacher would in a classroom. If one triplet started impersonating another, is it plausible that the third triplet wouldn't notice? Excellent question. No matter how alike the three of them may look, I don't think they could deceive each other as to who was who. Even if they could confuse their own father. That was a swipe at Bowen. Of course, the truth would probably have come out eventually sometime. No matter how much three people might look like each other, it didn't mean they were identical in every way. May I take it then that the youngest brother was aware that the middle brother had become the oldest brother? I'd say so. Maomao kept one eye on the brothers. They appeared to want to object, but they could not find the words. Why, Maomao thought, I think you know the answer to that. One does not become a Go master by being unintelligent. The answer to his question was simple enough to explain to the others. She suspected it had all been deliberate. She said if the second son disappeared, all their sins could be expunged, yes. She looked at the eldest brother, no, the middle brother. He glared at her, but there was nothing he could say. He just clenched his fists. Is this true? Bowen looked at the boys. Can you really not tell? Can you really not discern one of your sons from the others? Maomao said. Bowen stared at them fixedly, silently. Maomao Lumen said, "My apologies," she said, and stepped back. In that case, the remaining two brothers must know where their oldest is, Jinchi said. Upon his remark, they felt compelled to speak. His beauty held such power over them. What happened to our brother? The third son was the first to speak. I did not do it, it was Ji. What, traitor? The second son grabbed the third by the collar. This is all your fault, cried the youngest brother. It was your mistake grabbing some girl. Why couldn't you have picked someone who wouldn't make trouble for us? You're one to talk. You can't find a mark who doesn't become a problem for us. Talk about sibling rivalries. I take this to mean the two of you killed your oldest brother, Maomao said. Not me. He killed him. No, he did it. It was impossible to tell who was accusing whom anyway. Liu Umen was staring at the fingers. He had noticed another detail. In addition to the white lines, there was dirt under the nails. Maomao gave the fingers a questioning look. At first they simply seemed dirty, but on closer inspection, she could see it was skin under the nails. I don't think there's any more talking your way out of this. Maomao took the hand of the second son. He had a red scratch that ran the length of his palm all the way to his wrist. It looked as if someone had scratched him with their nails. I did not kill him, the second brother said, his face contorted. He fell on his own. He was staring at the spilled grape juice. The wine, it was the wine, the third son hesitantly explained. There's been something wrong with Daji. Between the two of them the story came out. The eldest brother had been unwell lately and in a poor humor as well. He would suddenly fly into a rage or start shouting. But he would not stop drinking. Sometimes toxicity could show as instability in someone's personality. The condition of his fingernails suggested he had advanced lead poisoning. I thought, let Daji do what he wanted. It was none of my business, but he made such a racket that I grabbed my brother and we went to see our elder brother in his annex. Our elder brother was in his room, throwing a fit. When the other two came in, he sprang at them. I shoved him away before I knew what was happening, but he came at me again. That was when he got the scratch on his palm. I was trying to keep him off me. That is all I was doing. The man's brother had fallen backward and hit his head on a table. What in blazes? Bowen demanded, grabbing his second son. Do you realize what you have done? What I have done? This is because you left us to fend for ourselves. Neither man sounded particularly laudable. I was going to call someone. But Ji, he said. The third son looked at the second. Let's tell everyone I died and I'll become our elder brother. They would need proof to make it happen. They buried the body, keeping only the fingers which they cut off. All they had to do was write a threatening letter. Any number of suspects would suggest themselves to investigators. The entire matter would be cloaked in confusion. And so they did just that, cutting off their brother's fingers and sending the letter to their own household. But they had to pick which fingers to send. It might not have mattered whether they sent his head or his feet. It would have been possible to spot the symptoms either way. Perhaps not if they had chosen his ears. They would have been found out eventually. They must have really felt their backs were against the wall. Maomao knew this was where she should feel compelled to pray for the deceased, but in this particular case she couldn't let go of the feeling that he had reaped what he had sown. Her father was gazing at the fingers, still distinctly grieved. "You both are a disgrace, an embarrassment," Bowen yelled. "No more than you," said the second son, pounding the table. "When you realized you could not protect all of us, you decided to blame everything on me. But Daji was the worst of us all, and you are no better. Who gave you an alibi every time you got a little too familiar with father's concubines? So that is why the youngest son went along with this," Maomao realized. "Is this true?" Bowen demanded, turning to the third boy. "Oh, it is true," the second son continued. "Our 3-year-old sister, the one you love so much, she is his child. Oh, how you have doted on your first daughter, but she is your first grandchild. Gee, you swore not to speak of that. Is this true? I want answers." This is absurd, thought Maomao, and in all likelihood the others were thinking the same thing. To cut off a guy's fingers after he was dead, Maomao believed that once someone was dead, he was dead and wouldn't know what happened to his former body. Still, the sight of those fingers brought home what a reprehensible story this was. He wasn't the one she felt the sorriest for, though. That would be one particular nobleman who was now looking quite frustrated. He had made extensive preparations, used every means fair and foul to achieve his goal, and might even have done it had his game not been interrupted. Chapter 19, The Go Sage. Jinshi heaved a sigh and looked at the Go board populated by all its stones. He recalled what his Go instructor had said the other day. "I have to say, I think it's probably impossible." The man was the Emperor's own Go instructor, and in spite of appearances could be quite blunt. "You can't even beat me, not once. You have no hope against him." Impassive, the Go Sage snapped a white stone onto the board. GRK was the only sound Jinshi made. What else could he say? He had thought he'd played a pretty good game, but with one move the sage had unraveled all of it. He'd known perfectly well it might turn out this way. He was a jack of all trades, able to do most things to some extent. He was only a little better than average at most things. He didn't truly excel at anything. He was gifted but not a genius. Still, it was better than doing nothing at all. You have your Josuke patterns down perfectly, I will give you that. But if you stray from the established order, you have no more imagination than any ordinary player. You become anxious when faced with a move you haven't encountered before. You are quite direct, aren't you? I believe that is what you desired. The sage ate one of the buns Suhen had prepared for them. The snack might have seemed a little strange for such an elegant game as Go, but a sweet treat was apparently considered essential among players. Thinking naturally caused a craving for sweets, or so a certain eccentric strategist justified his constant consumption of them. For days now, ever since the Emperor had agreed to lend Jinshi his instructor, he'd spent every day after work feverishly studying Go. He lacked talent. His moves were simplistic. The instructor had pointed out the dull play style of the overachiever, and was perfectly merciless. Jinshi had said when they began that he didn't want the sage to spare his feelings, and the man had taken him at his word. When Jinshi asked whether the sage was so cruel to all his students, he replied, "I choose opponents who cannot punish me for what I say." He was very careful. He also knew how to motivate a person. You expect to beat that freak playing like that. Jinshi picked up a black stone and placed it on the board, unsure even as he did so whether it was the right move. He was working with the Go Sage because he'd heard he was the only man who could beat the freak strategist, also known as Lakan, at the game. "So you're convinced I can't win?" "Completely convinced." "You are much too forthcoming, Moon Prince. You are far too much of a straight shooter." Somehow, coming from the Go Sage, this did not sound complimentary. Be that as it may, I must find some way to best him, and I have come here to try to teach you how to do that. But it's absolutely hopeless. The Go Sage munched on another bun. "Give me any chance, any way to win even one time out of 100. When Lakan is at his best, even I'm lucky to beat him 1 out of 2 games. If I'm at my very best as well, I'm afraid I don't take your meaning." The Go Sage was better at the game than Lakan. That's why he was called the Go Sage. "Oh, I think you do." "Let me ask you this, Prince. Do you think you could defeat a bear bare-handed?" "Obviously not. How about a wolf? If circumstances favored me, perhaps, but it would be difficult. A dog, then, I think I could manage more or less." It was a lesson that had been driven home for him while hunting. Humans were surprisingly weak for their size. The use of tools enabled their survival. Without equipment, even a stray dog might prove too much for an unarmed man. What would you need to be victorious? The Go Sage asked. He placed a stone, earning another groan from Jinchi. His instructor had seen clear through him yet again, to emerge unharmed. A gun might seem ideal, but I'm not sure I could hit the creature. I think I would prefer a sword, something I am used to, or perhaps a dagger and gauntlets to protect my arms. With a sword, he would be able to hold his own, at least in a confined space. It would be much harder on an open field. He would lure the animal to a place where its agility was less useful. Then he would let it bite his forearm armor while he struck for the throat. You may look refined, but I see you are willing to use messy tactics when necessary. It would not be my first choice. I am simply not that skilled with the sword, Jinchi replied. Basin would be able to do a better job. He could probably face down that bear, Jinchi figured, but even he would come out of such an encounter gravely injured. In that case I have a stratagem that might just work for you. Stratagem? Oh, it is nothing special. Just a way of tilting the odds in your favor. The Go Sage leered, and for an instant his calm, cultured aspect vanished entirely. You wouldn't have to break any rules. The rules don't apply to what happens off the board. Jinchi swallowed heavily. The Go Sage was unequivocal. If this method doesn't work, you will never beat Sir Lakan so long as you live. I've lost. No matter how many times he counted and recounted the territory on the board, or the captured stones, he couldn't make his numbers greater than his opponent's. The difference was only 2 points, but it felt like 1,000. He had taken a strong lead in the middle of the game. His territory had been safe, and it didn't seem like things could change. Jinchi had not made any obviously poor plays. However, the honorable personage who was munching away at his snacks had proceeded to close the gap with blinding speed. Basin and some bodyguards were standing nearby. It was several days after the Go tournament. Jinchi was working in his office when the monocled strategist appeared with no warning. Let's continue, he said. If Jinchi had been simply shirking work, he might have turned him down, but it was lunchtime. A Go board and stones were waiting at an open-air pavilion near the office. The board was already arranged as it had been when their game was so rudely interrupted. A few onlookers watched from a distance. Jinchi had no reason to send them away or to refuse this game. He had considered what he might do to consolidate his advantage and seize victory many times since their standoff at the theatre. He could not believe he could lose after holding such a commanding lead. Impossible, Basin had said, astonished. Impossible, yes, that was the only word for it. What must it be like in that man's head? The Go Sage's words rang in his ears. You will never beat Sir Lakan so long as you live. Why had Jinchi's instructor compared his opponent not to a man, but to a beast? Jinchi felt a pang of regret. A bear, a wolf, or a dog, Lakan was none of these. He was a monster all his own, a fact Jinchi had failed to appreciate. Lakan adjusted his monocle, chugged some juice and looked to be in all-around perfect health. He was getting enough sleep and was not currently exhausted by a relentless series of Go games. There was no alcohol in his drink or his snacks, so his head was clear. Jinchi felt unutterably low. He had used the dirtiest of dirty tricks and he had still lost. He did not care for appearing pretentious, but this made him feel quite pathetic. If no one was watching, he would have fallen onto the board and groaned. Jinchi gathered his remaining dignity and attempted to look calm. If there was one quality he felt he could boast of, it was the thick skin he had developed during his time in the rear palace. He had to keep his chin up and act like someone who could take his licks with aplomb. He was about to raise his head when a finger appeared on the board. The finger pointed to a move in the endgame. You should have played it over here, Lakan said. Jinchi looked at him, stunned. The freak was scratching his stubbly chin and continuing to point. And this here, then White would have had nowhere to go. He was mumbling, making it hard to hear him, but he was unmistakably explaining Jinchi's errors. Master Lakan is doing an analysis, said the strategist's aide wonderingly. An analysis? The word sparked a hubbub among the onlookers. My honoured adoptive father very rarely performs such postmortems, said Lahan, who had appeared rather out of thin air. He must have come running when he heard the game would be continued, because he was slightly out of breath. It must mean, Moon Prince, that you have his attention. He emphasized those last words pointedly. Now, why did I make this move? The freak seemed less involved in analyzing the game and more in personal reflection. He seemed to be talking about his crucial error, and he didn't understand why he had made it. He remembered every move of the game, even though his brain had been addled with tiredness, fatigue, and alcohol. Jinchi could only laugh. In any event, that was fun, the freak said, coming over to Jinchi. I don't know what you're after, but your methods were fascinating. Then, leaving the game board as it stood, he walked away, swinging his bottle. Jinchi watched him go, dumbfounded. The crowd began to disperse. A few of the onlookers seemed to want to approach Jinchi, but Basin and the other bodyguards looked like they would allow none of it. Only Lahan remained by Jinchi, just standing around. Basin was not pleased by his presence, but he allowed it. He had rarely, if ever, spoken to Lahan, but it did not seem like they would get along very well. I can only apologize that my help wasn't enough, Lahan said. At least my father seemed satisfied, I suppose. Satisfied, Jinchi echoed. With my pitiful strategy, he gave a sarcastic smile. He had a sense he was being mocked. The specifics of your plan do not matter to him. If he says it was interesting to him, then it was. Jinchi did not quite follow. Lahan sounded like him. Maybe it was his blood relation to the strategist, or maybe those with such unique talents inherently understood each other. Jinchi finally decided to voice a question that had been bothering him. Why did Sir Lakan want to hold a Go tournament at all? To be quite honest, I think he would play Go whenever he wanted, even without money involved. Yes, and I suppose he would if left to his own devices. Lahan pulled out a book. It was the strategist's Go book that had started this entire craze. This book holds many records of games played between my honored father and a certain woman. Some of these games are as much as 20 years old. The sequences of moves were still in my father's memory. This is remarkable, considering my father often forgets who he saw yesterday. These games are priceless to him, and there shall be no more of them. This is all that's left. Jinchi had a reasonable idea of who the woman was. She was a courtesan from the Verdigris house and Maomao's mother. The year before, Lahan had purchased her at great expense. However, in spring of this year she had died. There will never be another quite like her. I think my father understands that. But perhaps he was hoping that, inspired by these records of past games, someone who played similarly to her might appear. So he was trying to resurrect the past? I think not. If anything, I believe he was trying to build a bridge to the future. Or perhaps my honored father doesn't think that far ahead. Lahan scratched the back of his neck, suddenly uncomfortable. I do wish he would do post-game analyses of his other matches, just as he did with yours. What if the people who paid for teaching games ask for their money back? Teaching, what does that mean? Jinchi said. He did recall hearing that one could pay for the privilege of playing a game against the strategist, although most of those games had been postponed because of Lakan's indisposition. We have spent the last several days trying to manage those teaching games. I don't mind telling you, accommodating everyone's schedules has been a nightmare. He had been playing a game against someone else, and when it finished he suddenly disappeared. I found him here. That is why I was a little breathless earlier. Lahan said, if I may ask a question. Yes, what is it? Was it the Go Sage who suggested that plan to you, Master Jinchi? It wasn't really a question. The sage had been at the tournament. Lahan probably knew perfectly well what had happened. Jinchi said, I was borrowing time that was rightfully the Emperor's for my instruction. Lahan said, well, that makes sense then, and nodded. He continued, my father often complains that there are only ever savory snacks on hand during his games with the sage. Jinchi said, So the man truly did not want to go bare-handed against a bear. Now then, I believe I will be on my way. One more thing, Lahan said, and he smirked a little. Those treats you brought the other day. My honored father seems to be quite taken with them. He would like to know how to make them without alcohol if possible. Also, I know how he acts, but my father hates being in debt. He doesn't look it. It is true. Even if he sometimes forgets the debts he owes, Lahan said quietly as she was pregnant. Then he trotted off. That looked like quite a conversation. Is everything all right? Basin asked, coming over to Jinchi looking somewhat disturbed. All right, we were simply chatting about the weather. Ask Suin to write up the recipe for those snacks, would you? Yes, sir, without the alcohol. Understood, yes, sir. Jinchi left the pavilion behind and Basin followed him, puzzled. They found something at Jinchi's office when they returned. What have we here? Jinchi asked. Basin took off the cloth covering the object, revealing a Go board. It was the kind used in formulating military strategy. It was a simpler version of something in the strategist's office. When he saw the arrangement on it, Jinchi raised an eyebrow. Doesn't like to owe favors, eh? He muttered. Jinchi had been a staunch advocate of strengthening the army. He foresaw trouble to Lee's north and west. Baryu poked his head out from his corner of the room. A fine job he did of rearranging things, wouldn't you say? He has addressed everything you were worried about, Master Jinchi. I was hoping he might feel he owed me a little more than this. Maomao entered the room with a sheaf of papers and immediately began speaking to Jinchi.